Hi everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Today's guest is Nick Jaworski. Nick is an internationally recognized executive in the field of behavioral health marketing and operational consulting with experience building organizations across 4 continents. As the owner of Circle Social Inc., he has helped healthcare organizations ranging in revenue from 10 million to 300 million a year perform turnarounds and accelerate growth. Nick was originally an ELT teacher in Turkey and China, so we talk about his time in ELT, how he transitioned to becoming a successful CEO. Nick's mission is to improve and advance the field of behavioral health and addiction treatment from clinical to communications. He also has a industry trends newsletter and the Recovery Executive podcast. So we talk a little bit about addiction and addiction care in the USA and further afield. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Hey everyone, buckle up for a new episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast, the one and only podcast made to help you launch your business or take your existing business to a level of success you could never have imagined. Whether you're a school owner, freelancer, publisher, or other entrepreneur, you're sure to pick up lots of actionable advice when you listen to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Remember to visit eflmagazine.com for great articles and features. Without further ado, here's your host, the founder of EFL Magazine, Philip Pound.
Okay, welcome back everybody to the latest episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. I'm delighted today, as I always say, I'm delighted, but I'm really delighted today to have Nick Jaworski on the show for you. And Nick is, you know what, I forgot to ask your job title. Is it SEO founder, or sorry, CEO, SEO.
Yeah, I mean, it's my company, so I'm CEO these days.
Okay, so the chief of CircleSocialInc.com. So Nick, how are you today? Where are you today?
I'm doing real well. So I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana. That's where we're based, and that's where I've been living for the past 7 years at this point.
Oh, is it 7 years already? Because I've known Nick for quite a while. I think, Nick, we first connected back in, maybe 7 years ago. I think at that time you were just transitioning to your life back in the US. Isn't that right?
I think so. I think it was quite a bit longer than that. It's definitely we were in China at the point where we first originally connected. You know, I did some articles for the website. It was kind of getting going just around, you know, the peripatetic lifestyle of an EFL teacher.
That's right. And I remember you did kindly wrote a few articles. One was about from teacher to manager, if I can remember. And the other was about your experience in Turkey, wasn't it? And now I do remember because originally, didn't you say you come from Oshkosh?
Yes, that's
right. Well, how I know that is how does he know that? My uncle was a big flyer. He sadly passed away a few years ago. And I think he used to go to Oshkosh, if not every year, maybe every 2-3 years. Yeah. So for people who don't know Oshkosh, tell me about the Oshkosh and Oshkosh air show.
So Oshkosh, Wisconsin is a small little town of 50,000-60,000 people. But it has a EAA convention every year, which is a week-long fly-in for airplane enthusiasts. EAA is Experimental Aircraft Association. And it is, so Oshkosh, Wisconsin becomes the busiest airport in the entire world for a week. We have a plane landing and taking off every 7 seconds. So it's just an insane time. I actually worked at the airport for a couple of years and would fuel planes and stuff back in college. But yeah, it's a whole thing. And so, if you fly planes, you know of Oshkosh.
And are you a flyer? Have you taken lessons? Have you gone solo or?
I'm not. I mean, I've been up in planes, right? Especially when I worked at the airport, we'd go up quite a bit. But I was a poor college kid. I didn't have the money to pay for flight lessons at the time. Though recently I've been thinking about getting back into it. So get my license in the next year or two here.
Yeah, it's really. I remember my uncle had a Cessna.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Cessna's I think the most
Yeah, it's just
it's the most well known
regular
brand is
man's
a
plane.
make of light aircraft. But yeah, I'm not such a great person for heights. But actually, I wasn't so scared, and it's great fun, and like I could
Yeah,
take the
yeah.
wheel and turn and yeah, there was a local airfield that he used to operate out of. So yeah, good
Sure.
times. Brings back some good memories of flying and
Yeah, I
but
bet.
yeah, and for you too. I mean, when you think of flying and all the great movies like The Great Waldo Pepper, that's kind of brings to me the idea of the Midwest and barnstorming. Is there
Mhm.
that kind of tradition?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I see the nostalgia. You don't see that around too much anymore. But flying's a thing, and people that like it love it, right? Like there's a very hardcore passion for people that fly. Um, and it's not as expensive as people think. I mean, back when I was in college, I couldn't afford it, but really to get your pilot's license, it only costs a couple grand. And then on my end now, because I fly all the time, because I do a lot of consulting across the US, I mean, technically it's a tax write-off. I could pay for the plane and the flight lessons, for the business. And then I get a plane, which is nice.
Is it because of I think that was it because of the Wright brothers, or is it because of crop dusting that planes are so popular in the Midwest?
That's a great question. I don't know. It could be both, right? I mean,
Mm.
Wright brothers were Ohio, and then a lot of farmers have crop dusters. A lot of farms in the Midwest, so could be the situation.
Could be the situation. I don't know. I've never been to the Midwest. So tell me about the Midwest. What people think it's just long plains, grain, dry climate, cold winters. Is that? I mean, there's more to it than that, obviously. But tell me what it's like
Sure.
growing up in the Midwest.
So it's super nice. I mean, like yourself, I've lived all over the world, and I did a lot of that through EFL teaching, right, and school management. But still, when I look back, like the Midwest is probably the nicest group of people. And so, in terms of just raising a family, it's fabulous. In terms of the cost of living, it's phenomenal. I mean, you can just get a very nice house and not have a lot of traffic and just have good people and good activities and all that kind of stuff in the Midwest in the US. And so it's a little bit dry, right? Like it's not a destination. I'm not going to fly from Japan to go to the Midwest or something. We don't see a bunch of Chinese tourists when we're around the Midwest, right? But it's a great place to live. And that's what I tell people. And that's how we even ended up in Indiana. Eventually, I was working with a school system who had brought me down here to fix up one of their schools here in Indianapolis. And even for us, we're like, oh, it's just a bunch of cornfields and stuff, right? But it's great. It's a fairly international city. We have a lot of people coming from all over the world. But at the same time, super cheap, super good people, lots of opportunity, and you can fly out anywhere. So I fly a lot for work these days, and I live 15 minutes from the airport, so I can get anywhere in a quick hop. So yeah, it's a good place.
Yeah, and I remember you said you were a small town boy. Well, I think actually I didn't know Oshkosh was that small, but it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So small town boy, and then you decided to up sticks. Like go abroad, go for the EFL teaching. I was talking to Dave Sperling a couple of months back, and I think, well, he grew up in LA, which is not so small, obviously. But where he grew up, I think in Encino, he said it's actually at the time it wasn't so multicultural. It was just like white middle class place, but it's changed now. So that kind of that was kind of the push factor, and maybe the pull factor was other ethnicities exploring the world, and as ESL students like to say, broaden your horizon. So was it the same for you? Was for me, just want to get out and see the world and something different.
That was a big part of it. So, I mean, very white, middle class, small town, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So a couple pieces, like one, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I didn't see a lot of opportunity, right? I didn't even know opportunity kind of existed. I was just like, well, kind of go through high school, maybe go to college, maybe you don't. You end up in some factory or office job that you don't really like. You get really drunk on the weekends, and then you retire with a little bit of money and you die, And that was really kind of the life that I saw ahead of me. It was not appealing. I'm a bit of a risk taker, right? And so I looked around and said, well, I want to go abroad. How the hell do I do this, right? And this was back before we had the internet and all these guys, and you knew what you were doing, right? Like no one I knew had even had a passport. They didn't know how to get one. I had to research how to get a passport, right? And again, the internet wasn't that great at the time. So I had to ask around. I started asking like my teachers, right? My professors at college, because they were the only people I know that had actually been outside the state, much less the country. So I had a particular professor that helped me get my passport. And he says, why are you looking like a teaching thing? I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, looking at teaching. And so I did, and started finding some of these places online and started calling them up, right? And eventually settled on the Language House in Prague, which was a phenomenal program. It's still around, actually. Chris Westergaard runs it, and he's still kicking it out. But yeah, so that was it. I really just wanted to go abroad. I really wanted to experience the world. And I think like a lot of people, I said, I'll go for a year or two, check it out, right? But absolutely loved it, fell in love with it, and just ended up doing it for almost a decade before I finally, eventually had a family and a child, and I decided I wanted to move back to the US. Also, China was not the funnest place to necessarily open a business. I ended up opening a bilingual immersion school with some Chinese partners down near Hong Kong and Guangzhou. And that was a nightmare of an experience. And so I was kind of put off by business in China. I'm like, it's time to go home.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We'll get around to your China story. But you started off in Prague. What
Correct.
year was this?
Oh God, 2006, I want to say, because right after I finished university, I went, I bought a one-way ticket. So I said, I'm going to make this work. Not good. I made a chance of going back, and I had not a lot of money either, so I really couldn't even afford to fly home. I had to figure it out.
I think there's different stages of Prague, wasn't there? I don't know what it was like. Maybe I was there. I've been to Prague maybe twice. I think around 2005, maybe 2000, maybe late 90s. I think 98. I think early 90s, it was what we would say, it was just opening up, and jobs were freely available. Everything was so cheap, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then what happened is prices started increasing. I remember when I went there in about 98, and then about 2005, I think prices had doubled or tripled. Was it that case? In Wenceslas Square and around there, you almost pay the same as anywhere else in Europe, maybe even Vienna, but a little bit outside, it's substantially cheaper. Is that
correct? Right. So Prague had, according to the people I talked to when I was there, like prices had quadrupled in the past couple of years, but still, like when I compared it to USD, it was still really affordable. It was still pretty cheap, and so it was more expensive than when you were there, but it was still cheaper than trying to go to Germany or Spain or something like that. So it worked out on my end.
Yeah, I remember. Was it Veliki
Tarnova?
Yeah, going there.
Bulgaria.
Oh no! I've been there also. The World Heritage town in České Krumlov.
I didn't go. I actually did not go outside of Prague. I
okay.
Down in Slovakia, but I just stayed in Prague. I was only there for a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. And most of the time I was taking my certification course, my TEFL certificate. So I didn't really have a whole time to get outside.
Gotcha. Yeah. So there's the České Budějovice, which is like the real Budweiser, isn't it? And then they have the České, I think.
That's right. I do remember that now.
Yeah. And České Krumlov at the old castle, and also the food was super cheap. You could get a Vienna schnitzel, the great Czech beer. For under $5,
Correct. It was really cheap. Yeah. And plus you were in like a 600-year-old castle.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But you always used to drive me nuts, because like one of my biggest shocks going abroad was how much Western music there is, right? So I remember getting on my first plane ever to Germany, or in Germany, because I stopped in Germany for a bit before I went to Prague, and they were playing that song by the Crash Test Dummies, and then I get to Prague.
Yeah, I know the one. Yeah.
They had like graffiti of Wu-Tang Clan all over the place. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And you go like one of the clubs, like what was it, like Red Lounge, something like that. And they're all busting out these rap lyrics, and they know every single word. And then you try and talk to them after, and they can't speak any English, but they've got all the rap lyrics memorized. It was just a big shock for me to realize how the music had westernized across the world.
Yeah, I remember being in Europe. I think I may have mentioned this on one of the other podcasts, but about 89, when the wall was coming down, I think I was in, or just, I remember, wasn't it maybe November, December 89? I think I was there maybe 90, so it was just after it. And there's the Scorpion song, The Wind of Change, if you remember that one. Yeah,
Yep.
that
Yep.
was playing everywhere in Europe, in like continental mainland Europe. Yeah.
Right, right.
But yeah, times change. So yeah, you spend a little while in Prague, and then what happened after that?
So I went to Turkey, and that was my original goal, was I wanted to get to the Middle East. I had a certain interest in Islam. I'm originally a religious studies major from university, so I had a strong interest in the religion, a strong interest in the culture, wanted to check it out. Ended up on Turkey for a couple of reasons. One, it is kind of a cross between East and West. And so since I'd never really left the state, much less the country, I figured I'd hedge my bets and not go too deep, give myself a little bit of comfort, I thought. And then it was just really one of the places that hires Americans for a decent salary, right? So if you go into the Gulf, you can make a crazy amount of money, but you have to have a PhD in linguistics to get hired half the time. Iran, Syria, Lebanon, they're not hiring Americans. So Turkey was just kind of also a default choice at the same time.
And you went straight to Istanbul?
No, I went to Ankara, which is the capital city of Turkey. It's a really boring town. It is, I mean, it's big, but it is just concrete and dry weather and cold and not a whole lot to do.
It's like one of these administrative capitals, isn't it? Like Brasilia or Canberra or something that's, or Ottawa. But I heard, I've never been to Ottawa, but I hear Ottawa's okay actually too. It's not that boring, but yeah.
It was all administrative in the army and stuff. So I was only there for, I think, 6 months. I'm like, I got to get out of here. And then I went to Izmit, which is about an hour and a half outside of Istanbul. And that's a small little town. But that's what I wanted. I wanted to immerse myself a little bit more, get away from the foreigners. And so I was like one of like 5 foreigners that could be found in the Izmit area, which I enjoyed. So I'd been learning Turkish for a little bit, and my Turkish really solidified there. I'm still fluent to this day, which I don't think would have happened had I been in Istanbul. Eventually I moved to Istanbul. I ended up marrying a Turkish woman over time. And then we moved to Istanbul, and I ran a school there for a couple of years. But yeah, it took me a while to get to Istanbul.
So I didn't realize it, but it sounds like you're a real innocent abroad. It's a little bit like if you remember Fraggle Rock, the uncle that sent the postcards back. Yeah. Right. So it's a little bit like that. I can't remember his name, but I put it in the show notes. But so you were kind of amazed that, let's say, Prague was so westernized and is such influence of rap, hip hop music. And then when you got to Turkey, what surprised you or shocked you, or what was some culture shock you experienced?
Yeah. So you have to remember I'm American, right? And so what is it? Like less than 20% of Americans have a passport. So
I thought it was less than that. I thought it was like 5% or something.
It might be.
Yeah.
I know it's a small number, right?
It's Japanese are the same. I think it's something like 5%. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So I mean, yeah, we don't have a lot of experience around it. In fact, I came from a small town, we didn't really have, people moving from other countries into Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That didn't happen. So all of it was new to me, right? And I didn't know what was going on, what I was doing. So I had to learn a hell of a lot. And again, we didn't have the internet. No one had smartphones. Like you're just walking around lost all the time and having adventures. But when I moved to Turkey, I mean, it was a lot of different features of culture shock. Like I was more familiar with Middle Eastern culture than most people, I think, just because I'd studied Islam and I understood certain aspects of it. But very conservative, right? And very different culture. Like we would go out to a bar, right? So you try to go to a bar, but you can't go to a bar and hang with anyone. Like this is not how bars work in Turkey, especially if you try to talk to a woman, right? Like that's just completely off limits. And so you might see this one woman walk in the bar and you're like, oh my God, finally. And you're like, hey, and immediately 4 guys come up to you like, no. We don't. You're like, oh, okay. So that kind of stuff, I went out with a bunch of students and they were like, oh, let's go get rowdy. Let's go get crazy. I'm like, that'd be fun. I'm kind of bored, And so there's 7 of us. We go to a gas station or something and they buy a 6-pack of beers. And then we go and we sit outside the car and drink 7 people drinking 6 beers. And like, isn't this crazy? I'm like, yeah, man, so that kind of stuff was definitely different, and definitely a lot of the relationships between the sexes was very different. And then as you get into the culture, right, like eventually I started to learn the language, and I got pretty deep, a lot deeper than a lot of the expats I was living in or with or near or whatever. And you realize that different cultures have radically different ways of understanding the world, of relationships, of values, of just kind of different perspectives. And you start getting that culture shock piece where it's like, oh my God, everything I assumed I knew about myself and life and reality is actually just very culturally constructed, and so you go through that, which was fun.
So when you say you go to a bar and it's just that people don't tend to speak to strangers, they tend to go with their friends, as a kind of a clique, and there's
very strong social network, right? So unless I can connect to you somehow, like unless I know you somehow, like you don't just go and meet other people, right?
Gotcha, yeah.
So that was very off. I mean, even if it's all social webs and social networks. It's who you know, right? Family, clan, tribe, and so even when I would talk to people, like they'd be like, oh, Jaworski, like they're like, that's Polish, and Polish was once a part of the Ottoman Empire. And so, okay, now I know where you fit in my world, right?
Okay.
Or they're like, hey, do you ever go to this gym, or do you go to this school? Like they're trying to find where you fit in the social network and everything, which is just a little bit different from the US. And I'm pretty gregarious, right? I'll just go out and meet people. I mean, I was used to that. In Europe, I could do that. Europe, I could just walk into a bar and meet people, or walk on the street and say hi and hang out with the crowd for the day or the week or whatever. But in Turkey, it doesn't really work that way.
Gotcha. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, so it's not exactly like it, but as a French friend said to me, living in Paris, you don't just speak to a stranger. It's like in a bar, the person will just completely ignore you. It's like, who are you? Where are you from? Do I know? Do we have anything in common here? What's your your rank? Yeah.
That was very much it. I mean, Istanbul is a little bit different because you got so many expats and a lot of European influence, but the rest of Turkey, not so much.
Yeah, and I'm not so surprised by the male female thing in a bar. I mean, that's very different from the movies you see in the US, isn't it? It's in Ireland, we have a bar culture, but it's not so much about all right. There's a kind of picking up thing, but I think in the US, whenever I see the movies and there's a woman in the bar, it's about picking up. Is that right? Is that kind of the culture in bars? Mm.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty accurate, but yeah, I mean, that's fairly accurate, right? It's not like you can just walk into a bar and pick someone up, but at the same time, it's much more common. And that came out in Turkey quite a bit, right? So that's the assumption of how the West works, right? And so like I had a US girlfriend, I brought her over to Turkey after 6 months or something like that. And, it wasn't the best experience for her, right? And a lot of Turkish men would just make the assumption that like, oh, you're Western, so I can just pick you up and you'll come to my apartment and sleep with me and stuff. And there's a lot of harassment that occurs because of that misconception. So you get those kind of problems. But even eventually, especially when I was living in Izmir, I got very into the culture, and I was just very used to having the gender separation. And you can go out and you can hang with mixed sexes. That's not a problem, but there are always chaperones in place, right? Or you have multiple people there. Like you would never go alone with someone of the opposite sex. I mean, a lot of the girls had to be home by like 5, 6 o'clock sometimes and stuff like that. And so I remember after I'd been there for like a year and a half, I went to Istanbul. I think I had to get some visa work done or something. I'm sitting on the metro and some woman comes in the metro and there's a whole bunch of empty seats and she sits down next to me. I start freaking out. I'm like, who is this woman? I'm like, why is she sitting next to me? I'm like, is she trying to pick me up or something? Like what's going on here? Because it was so outside of bounds of what I was used to, right? And probably the woman was probably a foreigner. Because I doubt a Turk would have done that. But just you get pretty deep into the culture, right, and deep into the mentality, and you don't even realize it, but it's happening unconsciously.
It's very interesting. And so, how did you meet your wife then? How did that come about?
She was a student at the school I was teaching at. So we were part of the same friend network. And so I'd go out with a bunch of the teachers and the students after classes every day. And she was part of that network. So we eventually got to know each other through that, and relationship just kind of slowly developed over time. And just one thing led to another.
And no looking back. Yeah, that's the way it
No,
happens, isn't it?
no.
So,
Yeah.
tell me about your working experience in Turkey. I've spoken to a few guests about Turkey and kind of students, exams, their enthusiasm for the language, or obviously it varies, but as far as I know, for example, TOEFL is quite a big exam in Turkey, isn't it? And there's
Correct.
a bigger middle class, and a lot of them, they want the sons, daughters to study in the USA, for example. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously TOEFL's US, where IELTS was more British, right? And I don't know. I mean, maybe because I was American, I always taught the TOEFL classes eventually, right? I did a little bit of IELTS, but usually you'd have the British teacher do the IELTS. And so I don't know if that split was 50-50 or whatever, because by default I'm teaching TOEFL. But TOEFL was a hell of a lot harder than IELTS, at least back in the day, right? I mean, IELTS was just kind of like a multi-choice test with some written components and stuff, right? TOEFL, I mean, you really had to know the language, and you had to know cultural aspects of the language, right? It wasn't just grammar and spelling and some writing. And so those were intense classes for students. We really did a lot of prep, and they were super fast, right? It's like you got to listen to a 45-second speech of Martin Luther King, right? Then you have to read an essay on it by some student, and then you have to synthesize all of that information and create a unique, written document talking about your perspective on it. And like, I mean, in like 15 minutes. It was very hard.
Notoriously difficult test.
Yeah.
So how about doing business in Turkey? Decision making, level of formality, all those things. What did you experience?
Very informal, right? Very informal. If they like you, they're happy to work with you. If they don't like you, they're not going to work with you. It's a lot of, I don't know if I want to say superficial, but it's a lot of surface value, right? You see that in a lot of countries around the world, but the fact that you're American or have an American accent goes a lot farther than your ability to teach. But you also saw that with students, right? So eventually I started managing schools, right? I taught for a while and moved into teacher training and then to school management. And the teachers or the students would say, well, I want that teacher because he's American. I'm like, he's actually my weakest teacher. That's why I don't want to put him in your class. It's not because, I don't like him or something. Like, you guys will not learn as much if I put him in there. I'm still training him, right? So you get those kind of aspects of it. I don't know. A lot of them were very poorly ran, right? Incredibly poorly ran, really crappy, just follow the textbook, no training. And that's most of the TEFL world, but they wouldn't teach teachers how to do anything. You'd have a teacher that was teaching for 10 years and he's still teaching like grammar worksheets out of a book, which would just kill me. So when I eventually ran my own school, what I do is I would abolish the books. I would abolish the tests. I say, you need to understand your students and their level and where they are, and build very specific lesson content for them. And once they got good at that, then I would give them, the curriculum back to use. But then they would be more intuitive about it, right? They would say, okay, well, actually, whatever we're supposed to teach tomorrow doesn't make sense for my class, so I'm going to change it. Or based on where my class is and my students are, I'm going to modify this lesson to be more appropriate for them. So once they had that skill set, then I'd let them go back to it. But yeah, most schools, they just give you the book. The book's usually crap. They run through
photocopied probably as well. Yeah.
All the time. All the time. Here's a bunch of worksheets and but again, that's most of the tougher world. And you get it because most people are coming off. I mean, sometimes they have like a week certification, at best you got a month. Most people don't have a teaching background. So you work with what you got. But I always felt bad because I felt the students weren't getting their money's worth.
So tell me so you went from, as you said in the article, teacher to manager. So was one of your responsibilities to increase the number of students, increase business, or was it just teacher management?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer was just teacher management.
Okay.
So now I own my own business, and I've worked in higher level businesses where I did have responsibility for P&L, for profit and loss, right? So it meant I had to be, heavily involved in the marketing, heavily involved in sales. But when I did that first school in Turkey, none of that. I had a marketing manager and a sales manager, and they worked with the owner, and I had almost no communication with them outside of the times when they said, hey, we got a new student signing up, you need to put them in a class. So that was a big failure in hindsight, right? It was probably fine for me at the time because I was just thinking from school management, and I was focused on hiring, I was focused on training, I was focused on the results that the students were getting. So I would say that my role was like a learning director, right? But it definitely would have helped our school more had we had some more marketing and sales in there, because we were really good. Like we used to get really good results, but ended up being the fact that nobody knew we were there, outside of word of mouth.
Okay. And what's the marketing? What you do know of marketing in Turkey? What's important? Is it the name of the companies? The bigger chains have an advantage? Is it the quality of the teachers? You said word of mouth. Is it a type of programs you put in place? What attracts and keeps students?
So, obviously what attracts and keeps students is reputation, like any business at the end of the day, right? But if no one knows your business exists, it doesn't matter how good you are, which is kind of a second mistake a lot of organizations make. So you take English time, right? I don't want to get too specific into certain programs, but at least back then, not the highest quality program in the world, right? But they were one of the largest operators in Istanbul because they did a lot of marketing, and everyone knew who they were, and they would intentionally buy or lease locations in highly prominent, high traffic areas, right? And so just through that, they'd get enough students in, and you'd have all these little schools on back end alley streets in the middle of nowhere. Well, no one knew they existed, and so then they wondered why they were small and they couldn't grow. So you have to have both, right? Ideally. So, if you told me, if you say you gave me, a couple $1 million and say, Nick, go build a bunch of schools in Istanbul and beat out English time, it wouldn't be that hard because you would just market well, but then provide better quality. And eventually those two things will work together to build your flywheel, right? So you got the marketing and the quality business. What happens when you've got a low quality business is marketing almost works to your detriment, right? Because people get really upset. So English time was another example. They wouldn't pay for paper. So people wouldn't have paper. Their textbooks were written by just some random teachers at one point. And so students got really upset, right? They'd get really angry, really poor quality, and that generates a negative word of mouth. And so you're then dependent on constantly spending a bunch of money on marketing to get new students in who have never heard of you. And eventually the number of students who haven't heard of you gets less and less, right? It becomes harder and harder. So you're paying more and more money to get fewer and fewer students from a marketing expense standpoint. Whereas if you're delivering really high quality education, that becomes a virtuous cycle. You actually end up spending less on marketing because more of your word of mouth and community referrals come in, and it works in your favor, and students stay longer. So you have longer retention. So, one acquisition of a student costs, ends up making you more money than if you were constantly cycling them in and out. So you want to have both. You want to have a really quality program, and you want to have good marketing in place. Those are the best of both worlds.
Okay, and as I think the same here in Japan. It's if you're near the station, if you have prominent signage, you get a good footfall, and people, you get some walk-ins. You get that, the repeated message, isn't it? You get to see it 7 times, and and then you get the marketing on the street with the tissues, and maybe in the subway stations, on the on the computer pop-ups as well as.
And you got to commit to that. A lot of schools and a lot of businesses, they don't want to spend money on marketing because they think it's a cost. Marketing is never a cost when you doing it right. When you first start a new business, or if you're marketing in a new geography or a new territory, there's an upfront spend until, like you said, maybe you hit those 7 or 12 repetitions. But you always make more money off of marketing. We do $4 million a year, in the current company that I built. And that is because we make our clients money, right? To them, they view us as a growth mechanism. They don't see us as a cost center. But a lot of people see marketing as a cost center, and that's because either they're not doing it well, or they're not understanding the correct amount of timeline based on where they are in the business or in their mind share, reputation, the community, et cetera. So, but if you understand those numbers, if you know your math, if I know what my cost per acquisition is, if I know what my cost per inquiry is, if I know what my conversion rate is from inquiry to admission, right, then it just becomes a little bit of math and say, okay, I know if I spend 10 grand, I'm going to get 4 students, and that's profitable for me. And if that's not, well, then I need to market on a different channel or do something differently.
It's like when I worked in advertising, sometimes people didn't want to talk about advertising or marketing. They said, "Oh no, I'm getting new wallpaper here today and a new couch. I'm getting a new office. This is going to make my business more successful." But yeah, it's the marketing is everything, isn't it, for the business?
It's super important. I mean, it's super important. But what I always say is marketing. The purpose of marketing is to build trust with the consumer, right? And so if you build trust, then they're willing to pick up the phone. Because if I want you to give me 10 grand, I got to trust you quite a bit, right? So the marketing should build that trust, but then it's always up to the sales team to convert it, right? Marketing can drive the inquiry, but they're not going to make the person buy, which is a mistake a lot of business owners and school administrators make. You have to have a good sales team, and that marketing messaging has to be aligned. So if marketing is saying one thing and then sales is saying something different, that's a problem. But then a bigger problem is if you're delivering something different. And this is what I see in a lot of the businesses that we work with now is we have to go in and help them drive alignment between marketing message, sales message, and what's actually being delivered. Because marketing can kill your business, like I was saying before with the examples in the schools we talked about. If you deliver a poor product, then I'm upset, right? Now I paid money to get you in. I get mad. I leave. So you're not making any more money off me. I tell everyone I know not to go there. And I probably start leaving online bad reviews. So eventually, because there was a disconnect between the message and what was actually delivered, marketing ends up driving the business into the ground really fast. Whereas it's the exact opposite if you deliver what you say you're going to deliver. It doesn't have to be perfect quality, right? I mean, I always give the example of McDonald's. McDonald's is not known for great quality or great service. It's known for fast food at a cheap price. And I ask people all the time, I said, have you ever gone to McDonald's and gotten your order messed up? And everyone's like, yeah, it's happened. I said, have you ever then gone back to McDonald's after that, even though they messed up? They're like, well, yeah. Well, why? Because you don't go there for good service. You don't care. But if I'm going to a nice steakhouse, right, and I'm paying $100, $150 a meal for me and my significant other, and they mess up the service, I will never go back there. Right? Because I expect good service from a nice steakhouse. So you have to understand what your value proposition is, right? You have to understand what promise you're making sure there's alignment among those pieces. And that creates a virtuous cycle of business growth at the end of the day.
So specifically for ELT, for somebody starting a school or a business in this sector, what's some mistakes people could make with their marketing and their sales and their delivery? There's inconsistency.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, lots of mistakes. Like I said, a misalignment between the message and what's being delivered. That's a big one. So don't go around telling everyone you're the best school in the world if you're just an average school hiring average teachers or whatever it is, right? That will kill you right off the bat. Your reputation will become negative, and then you can't get off the ground. You can absolutely spend too much on marketing, right? I always say there's a floor to marketing and there's a ceiling to marketing and there's a floor to marketing. So on the ceiling end, I can only get so many patients. There are only so many patients. I'm thinking of my behavioral health world now, but there's still only so many students in a given area, right? So if I live in this area, there's maybe only 100 students a month potentially looking for teaching services. And so no matter how much money I spend, no matter how much effort I make, I can't get more than 100 students. And the reality is that you're not going to get those 100 because you got competitors, right? And some of them will go there. So you have to understand what your ceiling is and what a reasonable spend is. And that's per channel, right? My Google ad spend is different from my billboard spend, is different from my TV spend, different from my boots on the ground, people I got walking around, handing stuff out spend. And I have to know what that ceiling is per channel. And then there's a floor. There's a minimum amount you have to spend on marketing. Right. So in my world these days, it's $150 per inquiry. That is like the norm across the entire US. So we work across the entire US with companies everywhere at every level of care. And it's extremely rare to ever try and get below that. So if it's going to cost me $150 a call, it's going to cost me $150 a call. Right. And so if my call team only converts 1 in 3 calls, well, I know I need to spend $450 minimum to get an admission. So if you come to me, and we'll get companies that do this, and they're like, well, hey, Nick, we'd love to work with you guys. We want to spend $2,000 a month, right? Well, the way that the metrics work in the behavioral health space is the norm is like 5,000 to get an admission. So I can't even get you one admission with that. So you're not spending enough money to even get there. And then they'll be like, oh, well, I want like 10 admissions. Well, that will never, ever happen. So same thing when you're building a school. What's the minimum you need? And then understanding your metrics and troubleshooting, right? So if I should be paying $1,000 in admission, and that's kind of the norm in my area and my field or whatever, and I'm paying $4,000, well, why? What's wrong? Is my marketing message off? Am I targeting the wrong audience? And then it's not always the marketing. And a lot of times it's not the marketing. It's the admissions team, right? The people answering the phone are not converting at the right percentage. I should be getting a 10% conversion rate and they're only getting a 4% conversion rate. Well, something's wrong with my call team. Or we are getting people. So my marketing's working. I got a good cost per inquiry. I've got a good conversion rate with the admissions team, but I'm still losing students or not at the right enrollment numbers because students are leaving really fast. Well, I've got a quality problem, right? Something's going on with the delivery in the school where students are leaving and not staying for the whole program or not continuing, on in the program to different levels, et cetera, et cetera. So those different components are the really big ones that I notice. And then patience is a huge one. A lot of people just think because people need education that they're going to open a school and, kind of a build it, we will come mentality. That never happens unless you are the only game in town. If you are the only game in town, that is possible. You'll open up and there's all this demand and there's pent up demand and they'll fill. But then what happens over time is competition comes in and it's not so easy, right? Most of the time, there's a lot of competition in the area. So you have to be prepared for slow growth and you have to have a marketing runway built in. How much am I going to spend in marketing and sales? What's my break-even point? In my world, again, with behavioral health these days, break-even point is 18 months if you run things real well. 18 months, you're going to lose money for 18 months. So are you prepared to lose money? Is that built into your pro forma, right? Is something that's really important to understand. And so you should have an idea of those numbers going in.
Okay, we'll get on to that in just one moment. But I before that, we could carry on for longer. But I want to talk about China, your experience there. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you told me earlier?
Lots of directions we could go with that. Like what specific do you want to dig into on China?
Well, let's not go too deep, but you I would say, did you get your fingers burnt there? You didn't, you weren't so, it wasn't such a success, or the timing, or
So when I first went to China, I worked for Disney. So I'd kind of become a little bit known. I built a reputation through a lot of social media that I did. I had a blog that was pretty well known. I think that's probably how you originally found me, Phil. I don't remember.
I can't remember now. Yeah, I think probably, yeah.
You would speak a lot of conferences, so EFL conferences around Europe. And so I had a bit of renown built around my name and my reputation. And so that's how I got pulled in by Disney. And they're like, hey, you kind of worked at this startup in Turkey. We're a startup at this point in China. Can you help us turn around this failing school? I said, sure, give that a shot. It was a slog, but I did. But Disney was an insular world within China, right? And so there was definitely elements of Chinese business that came through, but you just didn't see it as much because Disney really, brought in an American way of doing business. And so to make that more concrete, so when I left Disney and started opening up the school of Chinese partners, they would just lie to everybody, right? So like we were supposed to have a nurse on staff for whatever county or whatever you call it, regulations for the school. And they literally would just have a teacher, bring in a white smock and say she was the nurse, and so a lot of lying to parents about what the school entailed, what was going on, lying to officials. But that was just the norm, right? The law is not super important in China for the Chinese. It's super important if you're a foreigner, especially if you're a foreign company trying to come in. So like Disney was held to like every single minor regulation that could possibly exist. As a Chinese school, you're not. And so that's how they operate. But before I'd been hired by the school, I'd been very clear with them. Even though I was sheltered at Disney, I knew kind of what happened. I said, hey, look, I'm going to do this on the up and up. I'm going to do everything by the book. And that's the expectation. So if you're going to work with me, that's what's going to happen. And they said, yeah. And then that's not what happened at all. But that's also very Chinese. So Chinese don't really see verbal agreements, even written agreements, as written in stone. They are something that are valid for that day, given the circumstances. And so if you go to a Chinese person and say, hey, look, you told me this, we signed this contract, now you're changing everything. Like, well, they're like, yeah, well, when we signed that contract and where we are now are completely different times with completely different contexts. And so that no longer applies. Like that. So that's just the way that they look at things, right?
That's why there's a lot of white space at the bottom of Chinese contracts. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. So you had all the lying, and then they had a lot of issues with licensing and stuff, and like they were trying to bring in teachers illegally. They're like, well, Nick, we want you to just bring them in under the wire, and we'll pay them under the table, all that stuff. I said, I'm not doing that. I said, I told you that when you hired me, and it was a big risk. So China takes foreign visas pretty seriously. There's a lot of places in the EFL world where you can kind of work on a tourist visa and nobody cares. China does, and it's really hard to come in and not work on a legitimate work visa. So I refused to do that, and that caused a lot of conflict with me and the board and the investors. And so really, I think I was there 6 or 7 months. We got the school built, we got the classes open, and it was just a constant fight the entire time. I was just constantly fighting with the board. Eventually they just let me go. They're like, well, we can't work together anymore. I'm like, and whatever, hard situation, but it was absolutely for the best because I was so stressed out all the time. And I was constantly like having, pangs of conscience, be like, I'm trying to do the right thing. These people don't care. And so to give the best example I had, speaking with the chairwoman of the board, I said, finally, what's going to happen when these parents find out you lied to them? And she goes, Nick, well, just lie again. I was like,
double down,
double down, right? We did it before, we'll do it again. They want to come to the school, so they're kind of going to believe us, and this is how it works in China. So who cares? I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah, I remember being in the US elevator and here in Japan, but in the lift, and there's this beautiful landscape with this crystal waterfall, and I turned to one of my Chinese colleagues and said, that's absolutely beautiful. I said, is that in Yunnan or where is it? He said, that's Photoshop. This is China. Everything is fake. So, so that's that was a situation. But so you went back home, and I think when when we first got in touch all those years ago now, time goes so fast, and you kind of quickly got into the SEO space. Now, in our pre-chat, I just labeled you as an SEO company, but obviously you're a lot more than that. But a lot of your original blog posts were about SEO, weren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I came back to the US, I continued in education because that's what I was doing and that's what I was good at, right? So I ended up running a language school on the North Shore of Chicago. We had 14 schools across the country, actually, but I was running one of these schools. And we were teaching, it was a flip, right? We were teaching Chinese and German and French and Spanish to English-speaking American kids, right? So it was a world I knew. But I got into the marketing. So I was running the school, and this was kind of my first area where I started taking over the marketing and the sales aspect of it. I was responsible for it outside of just language or just the learning component. And I had built up a lot of marketing experience, just kind of building my own personal reputation, really, in Turkey. Like I said, I used to be a big name on Twitter. Everyone knew my blog. Like it was very well known across the EFL space. I was at a conference in Cyprus that I was speaking at. Cyprus is a small island outside of Turkey, if you're not familiar. And there's a couple of teachers from Japan. They're like, "Oh my God, you're Nick Jaworski." I'm like, "Who are you?" And they're like, "No, we've been following your blog for months." So anyway, I kind of figured out some aspects of marketing from that. And so I started taking over our Twitter account and our Facebook account and all that kind of stuff, right? Started getting really good results with it, right? We started getting new enrollments in just from kind of the reputation we were building online, started building partnerships in the community through some of our online conversations. And then that was when Facebook was just first starting to take off, or I wouldn't even say that, first starting to advertise. So when I was first advertising on Facebook for that school I was working at, I think we were paying like 14-cent CPMs, which are insanely cheap. Like nowadays, you're paying like $30.
And organic reach was much more, wasn't it? Before?
Yes, organic reach was huge. Paid CPMs were super small, and we even got a dedicated rep. Back in the day. Like now you can't get a rep unless you're spending $1 million a month or more. So it's a different world. But I started running Facebook campaigns, and we were getting enrollments in left and right. So like this company was not into marketing. They were giving me $500 a month, and I was bringing in like $50,000 a month in enrollments. So that was kind of a big heads up for me. I was like, oh my God, what's going on? So eventually I ended up doing a lot of social media trainings and really kind of taking over the paid media for the company for a small time. Unfortunately, that business wasn't really well ran. They started collapsing. So they started closing facilities. My facility was one of the ones that got closed down. They eventually closed them all down. I ended up going to work for KinderCare, which is the largest daycare operator in the US. They had a turnaround problem here in Indianapolis. Went to do that. Wasn't a big fan of it. The education doesn't pay very well in the US. So I went back and looked at my marketing experience, both kind of the personal reputation I'd been up, the marketing I had done for Disney. We had a marketing budget at Disney, so I'd support the center director on that. And then all the marketing success I had with the language school in Chicago, I said, why don't I just start my own company? Clearly I know what I'm doing here. I can make this work. And so let's just try it out. And that's what I did. So I started out of my house, it was just me, and literally I was taking care of my daughter half the time. So we'd go to these little like church playgroup areas that we have in Indiana and let her run around. And I would be writing blog posts and, bidding on contracts and stuff like that. But nowadays we're 5 years later, and I've got 30 full-time staff, and we're a multi-million-dollar business with a national brand and reputation. So we just built it, but we built it through quality, we built it through results, and we built it through a lot of hard work.
And Nick's website is Nick's company is www.circlesocialinc.com, and you can find Nick on LinkedIn and Facebook. And before the chat, you said you no longer use Twitter. It's not so good. Business wise, it's how about Twitter ads? What's your what's your take on those?
So a couple pieces with it. So all advertising is good advertising if your audience is there, right? If your advertising is not working, you're targeting the wrong audience, or you've got the wrong messaging, or maybe it's the wrong time, right? Like I can sell chocolates the week before Valentine's Day all day long. But February 15th, selling chocolates is a hell lot harder. So you've got right audience, right message, right time. So Facebook is the place where we do a ton of marketing, and Google's our kind of second one, because that's where everyone is, right? And if you know how to target and message on those platforms, you can reach 90% of your audience. TikTok is actually getting pretty big these days, right? Twitter is smaller. Twitter, I don't know what the numbers are. I haven't looked in a while, but it's something like 400, maybe 500 million users, so it's a quarter the size of Facebook at best. And then the average Twitter user is only on the platform for 7 minutes. So people spend like an hour a day on Facebook, and they're checking it all the time. Twitter, 7 minutes. So if you're not posting in that 7-minute window or running your ads at that time, the likelihood people are seeing you is small. So I'm not a big fan of it for that reason. But otherwise, in terms of targeting capabilities and your ability to message on the platform, it's fine, right? We don't do marketing on Twitter because they don't allow behavioral health marketing, which is a new rule they put in place 6 months ago. We used to run some small campaigns on there. But it all comes down to audience. Is your audience on the platform? Are they using the platform regularly? There's a lot of organic value in Twitter. Like if you build up personal social networks in the education space, Twitter is huge, right? As a journalist, Twitter is huge. So like we do Twitter outreach for SEO. So when we want to get backlinks, when we want to get stories, when we want to get PR, we'll do some outreach on Twitter that way rather than run ads on it. So it's a very targeted use. But I just got out of Twitter because I didn't find the same communities I had found in the education space. They weren't just there as much, and find the information that was shared as valuable. And then nowadays, I just hear it's a shit show. I just hear it's a lot of cattiness and people piling on and people fighting and stuff like that. So I tend to be on Facebook and LinkedIn, where I find a lot of value. A lot of people sharing really good content that I want to hear or I want to see. And so that's where I spend my time.
Okay. And the behavioral health space, why did you decide? Did you see that this was, there's some good opportunities there? Or is it a passion of yours, this particular industry? Yeah.
It's all of that.
Hmm.
So particular passion, personal experiences with myself and family with behavioral health issues and addiction. It's very meaningful work, right? And so, I mean, education is meaningful, right? But when I started the marketing company, originally we were marketing roofing contracts and e-commerce and behavioral health providers, and I don't know, we had a whole bunch of stuff, right? And so not all of it was something I was very passionate about. So I wanted to find something I was passionate about. We had randomly gotten a couple of behavioral health providers as clients very early on. A couple of them are still with us today, actually. And so we were good with what we were doing with them. There was a passion component there for us. But also I saw a lot of value in focus. And so what happens with a lot of marketing agencies and a lot of companies in general is they'll take anything that comes along, right? And they're like, okay, well, whatever's paying us money. Well, you can't build expertise and you can't build a reputation if you are all over the place. And so we said, we're just going to focus down. And so actually I cut off a lot of our clients. I said, hey guys, we're going to wind down these contracts. I'm just going to go all in on behavioral health. We started spending a bunch of money, a bunch of time there. And we're extremely good at it now. So we actually built out the benchmarks for the space because we had such a high intense level of focus, right? And that's what's allowed us to become a bigger and bigger business. So we double every year since I started the business, the size and the revenue. And I imagine that will continue to happen. I don't see why it wouldn't, but it's because we niche down and we are extremely focused in who we serve, how we serve them, and the internal expertise that we build up in getting those results.
Before the pandemic hit, a lot of the health stories in the US were around the OxyContin crisis, weren't they?
Mm-hmm.
And that has been kind of covered over really by, and maybe complicated also by, lockdowns and
Yeah.
COVID anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other podcast, right? So real quick on it, I mean, so your addiction rates in the US have been stable for 50 years. That's something a lot of people don't understand. They think that, addiction was skyrocketing during the opioid, epidemic as it was labeled. But the reality is people just switch drugs, right? They move from ecstasy to pot to opioids. Now we're on to meth and coke and stuff like that. And that usage is really determined by availability. So can I get a hold of it and how cheap is it, right? Because I don't want to spend a lot of money on drugs. So if I can get high for cheap, I'll do it. And so opioids were just cheapest as possible. They were free, right? You could get them from a doctor. And most people didn't get them from a doctor. Most people that became addicted actually stole them from friends or paid friends from or whatever. There's a lot of diversion that was happening at that time. There was such an excess of these pills all over the place. And so they became super cheap. And so that really drove opioid as the primary drug of choice for a decade or more. The problem with opioids is they have a very high overdose potential, right? So I can go and drink myself stupid. I can go smoke a bunch of pot and I'm probably going to be fine the next morning. But when you mix an opioid with alcohol, and most people are probably drug users, right? So once you mix it or you mix it with a benzo, it can stop your respiratory tract. You can vomit and kind of drown in your own vomit, which is awesome, right? And so it caused a lot of overdoses, which then drove a lot of the news around it and everything like that. So that was not good, right? And we're seeing that again with the pandemic. So on my end, because we see it through our clients across the country, huge increase in addiction, behavioral health issues, especially among adolescents. A lot of mental health problems and anxiety around the COVID and the lockdowns and the stressors and the lack of school, especially for the adolescents. So that has really driven another wave of patients, unfortunately. Good for us on the business end. We have a lot of clients that need a lot of help. And we're happy to connect people to quality care, right? Because they need it, but at the same time, it's negative because all these people need all this help. Yeah.
I didn't understand that.
I hope our listeners did. But so fascinating. Just one thing, I don't know if it's related to the state of the economy, the drugs that people take. But I remember, growing up in Ireland in the 80s, and let's say the economy was really in the toilet. It was like mass emigration and high inflation and corporate tax rates and tax evasion. The country was in a really bad place, and it had a heroin epidemic. And then, of course, we had the Celtic Tiger, and there was a cocaine epidemic. Is that generally what happens when people are sad? They take heroin, and when they have lots of money, they take the cocaine.
Coke is obviously more of a designer drug just because of the costs, right? So yeah, you find it more upper class, but you would be surprised how much Coke you find in lower income areas. It is a surprising amount. But still, cocaine is always going to be, I was just looking at the numbers the other day. I think it's like less than 1% of people struggling with a substance use disorder are struggling with a stimulant like cocaine. Like it's too expensive for most people, right? And the risks are higher, right? I mean, if I get caught with a kilo of cocaine versus a bunch of pot or something, usually there's more serious consequences. There's more social stigma around it. And so people are more likely. So the average length of a cocaine addiction is only about 4 years, whereas the average length of a marijuana addiction is like 18, if I remember right. Alcohol is like 20 plus. So it comes down to the social stigma and some of the negative impacts around. But yeah, 100% stress. I mean, the data has been super clear on that for decades. Socioeconomic status drives addictive use, right, and problematic use. If life is good, you might use recreationally, but you're probably not going to end up with an addiction. And it's super clear. Some people think, well, maybe it's because people get addicted and then they end up becoming lower income. That's not really true. I mean, it does happen, but like you can separate out the data, for example, by unemployment, and you can say, okay, well, people on unemployment on top of being low income actually have much higher rates of addictive use than people that are employed, even if they're employed in a low income position. And they'll look at those results and say, okay, well, what happened first, the unemployment or the addiction? It's always the unemployment. Unemployment happens first, then the addiction manifests, right? And then what you find is once they get a job, they've got some meaning, they got some purpose, some hope back in their life, then they tend to leave the addiction behind.
And it's often quoted the statistics of heroin use in the Vietnam War. I think they use it. Right. I think in a lot of the movies they put in cigarettes. I remember. I don't know if that's true or not, but they said that like so many soldiers during the Vietnam War, took heroin. I think. Well, it was kind of near the Golden Triangle, that kind of area, so maybe easy to get. But then when they came back, never used again.
Yeah, they just dropped it. Right. One of the biggest misconceptions you have is that drugs are addictive, right? I mean, drugs operate within your reward pathways, just like gambling or shopping or sex, right? Like none of us go around getting addicted to sex all the time, right? It's a small percentage of people. And usually those people have some problems in their lives, right? And drug use is the same. So when you actually look at prescription rates and the number of people that become addicted after receiving a prescription, it's less than 2%. It's a very, very small number of people. And even if you look at people that were addicted to prescription opioids, 75% of those people had never gotten a prescription from a doctor, right? These are people that were already in some kind of addictive use, right? They were already using alcohol or pot or something else in a way that was negatively impactful on their lives. Then they found out that, grandma had a stash of opioid pills in the cabinet that she got for whatever, and they started jacking them. And using those because they were free rather than paying a dealer for the Coke or whatever. And so that's how that kind of evolved in that direction.
Okay, fascinating. So if people want to get in contact, it's Nick Jaworski, and that's Jaworski. And Nick's website again is www.circlesocialinc.com. We could go on. I mean, it's fascinating the amount of value here for listeners and your insights into your industry and your profession. And Nick is also, as you said, on LinkedIn as well, if you want to connect there. So are you taking on more clients, or are you just sticking to the behavioral health space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually are diversifying out this year. We're actually taking on an orthopedic client. So we do a lot of hospitals, like psych hospitals. And so we're moving more into the physical health space is kind of one of the goals this year. We'll see, as the company continues to grow, I'm sure I'll start to build out additional wings over time. But having that strong focus in behavioral health was super successful for us for the first couple of years. So yeah, always interested in looking at exploring new possibilities. If someone wants to get in touch, LinkedIn is a really good way. Just, shoot me a connection request on there. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to people, if they want to email me, the email address is nick@circlesocialinc.com. And happy to talk about TEFL journeys. I mean, people randomly reach out to me because every once in a while, like, they'll found the blog's defunct now. Like I didn't renew it, years ago, but somehow people still find like old copies or something. Or I think articles I wrote on other people's blogs, and they'll reach out to me. I even had a Turkish researcher reach out to me a while ago, and they were researching Dome. If you're familiar with Scott methodology, I still am a huge advocate of his methodology. But people would reach out for me for like research quotes and stuff like that. It was interesting. So yeah, always happy to talk TEFL and school building or just making that move, right, from a teacher to a school administrator. Like, it's not always easy, but I'm happy to have that conversation.
Okay, Nick, thanks again.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast with Philip Pound. For more great advice and resources, check out eflmagazine.com. If you found this podcast helpful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.